So in this video we're looking at this whole idea of a single currency, which leads on really from a fixed and floating exchange rate. And there are areas of the world where countries have joined together and they've decided to have just one currency for that area. So the obvious one, as you'll be aware, is obviously the EU, where it says in 19 of the 26 countries that are in the EU actually have got a single currency. They've given up their own currencies and they're using the euro. Now, why is this important at the moment, possibly for an exam question, is that Croatia have now are going to join the euro in January of next year, 2023. There's been countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, which have also joined some time ago, and there's good evidence about that, and I'll do another video on what they have found when they joined the euro. And also there's the West African and Central African states, what they call the ECOWAS, and they have had a sort of single currency within each of those blocks called the CFA franc, and that was linked to the French franc and therefore the euro, but they're now thinking they might have a single currency as well. So I think there's a lot going on in the world economy about this, and so it would be a good question to be asked in the exam. So what we need to do is we need to look at the benefits of countries doing this, and then we'll look at the potential drawbacks. So these are the benefits here. If you want to take a screenshot of those, then that would be useful, and you can make your own notes as you go along. But I want to do this in a way where you could write a really good chunky essay with 3 points of maybe 2 benefits and 1 drawback, so that you can structure a good 25-mark essay on this. So the first thing about it is, and these are the first benefits, if you like, is there's going to be reduced transaction costs. In other words, when you are doing transactions within Europe now, if you are a French car manufacturer and you're selling into Germany, if you had two currencies of your own, then you had to pay a transaction cost. In other words, you take it to the bank, you take your Deutschmarks to the bank if you'd sold your cars in Germany, and then you would say, I need to receive francs, and there would be a charge for doing that. There'd be a charge for your French car manufacturer if they imported their raw materials from Spain. They would have to take their French francs, to the bank and convert them into Spanish pesetas, and so therefore they would be having a transaction cost. So with having one currency, you lose all of those costs, and so there's a reduction in the costs of doing business, which will therefore help businesses to almost complete the single market, in the sense that sometimes these costs got in the way of doing business. So a reduction in cost, which would therefore possibly be passed on to lower prices, which stimulates demand for those goods. So that's the first benefit you would talk about, alongside, I think, in a first point, the fact that there's now price transparency. It enables firms and consumers to find the lowest prices. In other words, what would possibly happen is that if you were someone in France and you were trying to buy a car, for example, you would look at the price of the car in francs and in Deutschmarks and in Italian lira, etc. And it was hard, they say, for people to work out, what is the lowest price. And so price transparency, because they're all now priced in euros, would make sure that all the firms were almost, if you think about it, sort of operating more like perfect competition, where there is sort of one price in the market, because you would, it's a homogeneous product. If you're buying a particular car, you've decided which one, and so you couldn't charge a higher price than the other companies, because obviously you'd lose most of your demand. So it enabled firms and consumers to find lowest prices, which drove prices down in the market, was the idea. Now, I think that's true for consumers because it is tricky to work out, your exchange rate and all that sort of thing. But I think for firms that can't be a big issue because, knowing where the French car manufacturer, let's say, was buying its brake pads from, they would have a spreadsheet and they would download the prices and the exchange rates all the time. So it wasn't too much of an issue for firms, but certainly price transparency would level up the prices and make sure they were being more competitive. So with this one, I think you need to talk about it being a more competitive market. The next one, which again is all part of your first point, okay, so let's go back. You've got reduced transaction costs and transparency and eliminating exchange rate risk. All of these are going to benefit because there's going to be an increase in trade within the Eurozone in this case. And what exchange rate risk is that you've studied the exchange rate, so you know that if the exchange rate falls, the price of your imported goods goes up. So what was happening was that if you were, for example, exporting your good, you're a French car manufacturer, exporting the good into Germany, then you would be able to work out that with the current exchange rate, you might make a profit on that, but when you come to fulfill your order, let's say it takes you 6 months to make the goods that the Germans want, it might be that the exchange rate, the franc to the Deutschmark, had moved in such a way that that transaction was no longer profitable for you. So what firms would do is this: they would go to the bank and they would say, we need to hedge our currency. Now what that meant was they would say, for example, the French firm would say, we are receiving Deutschmarks in 6 months' time. Can you fix, please, the exchange rate now for us? In other words, they would be selling Deutschmarks, what they say, forward in the market. Okay, now, yeah, that's a perfectly legitimate transaction, and banks were doing this all the time, but there is another cost to that. And so if you didn't have this exchange rate risk, you would basically be able to reduce your costs again. So all of these are saying that the cost of doing business within this big Eurozone area were going to go down, which therefore stimulates trade, and then you need to move on and say, and therefore trade is a good engine of economic growth and job creation and that sort of thing, and enables you to use your comparative advantage. Now, one of the key things here when we go back, and it's an overarching thing which we have to use in all of these areas, is that the exchange rate for weaker countries particularly tended to fall, and therefore those weaker countries tended to have higher interest rates to attract investors in to buy their currency, because if you're buying a currency which is falling in value, you're losing money. So if you were doing it to invest, you would need to have a higher interest rate in that country. So one of the benefits, and we'll come to here, is that the interest rate in different countries when they join the stronger euro now tended to be lower, and this is something that a lot of countries have found. And so if there's lower interest rates, because the exchange rate, the euro, is now stronger, then it attracts investment. You can have an increased investment, and also the big point here is that it increases inward investment, because firms from outside the Eurozone have now lost all those problems of transaction cost and transparency, etc., and so they are now more tempted to come and settle and invest in Europe. The other issue here, which sort of goes hand in hand, so I'd be doing these two as my second point, is that the benefits of the Eurozone is they were very strong on inflation. They had a real they had a target for inflation which would drive inflation down, and often countries which weren't in the Eurozone, they tended to have higher rates of inflation. They would allow higher rates of inflation, sometimes because of their relative inefficiencies, but there was an improved inflation performance, and so because of that, again, that is a benefit for investment, because if you go back to your lower sixth notes, hopefully you'll remember that inflation creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the enemy of investment. And so if you have a low inflation, you're going to be able to invest more in the economy. So increased inward investment, improved inflation performance, meaning that the investment in the economy rises, and then you can link that to aggregate demand and aggregate supply, remember, and talk about the rate of sustainable economic growth going up because there's higher investment. So third, the other point here, which you could bring in as a investment thing, there's meant to be also greater economic stability, because the monetary policy is taken out of the hands of the individual governments and it's given to the European Central Bank. So with increased investment, inflation and stability, these three here I would be linking to an increase in investment in the economy, these three here an increase in trade within the economy because of lower costs, etc. So if you wanted to bring those benefits together in 2 points, that's how I would do it. 1, 2, 3 there for trade, and these three for an increase in investment and job creation, that sort of thing within the economy. So the benefits of the single currency are great, and as I say in another video, I'll look at Lithuania, Latvia, and we might have a look at the CFA franc as well if you want it. But there's obviously drawbacks. The first drawback that often comes up in most discussions about should countries join is that you have to replace your currencies. But that's a one-off cost, and there is a cost there. But for example, I think it was in Lithuania, when they've reviewed it, they said the cost of doing that would just simply be repaid within the first year because of the improved benefits to the rest of the economy. The biggest cost has to be the loss of autonomy over your monetary policy and linked to that fiscal policy. So you need to be able to talk about the fact that when you give your currency up, you cannot increase the money supply, because that's the euro now and that's not your decision to make. You can't and you cannot set the interest rate. And so I'll bring these together. Monetary policy, manipulation of interest rates, quantitative easing, money supply, and exchange rates, of course, all of that has gone. So you have lost, any individual country loses control over its monetary policy, and therefore it loses the ability to devalue, okay, let me go back, which has reduced the exchange rate. But if you've gone into the exchange rates already, you'll have seen that there's an argument that devaluing is not really a good long run policy anyway, due to the effects it has on inflation and possibly lower productivity. So you are losing the ability to manipulate your exchange rate, and you're losing the independence of your fiscal policy. This is a slightly harder one, but if you were running the euro, the European Central Bank, they can't allow every individual country to expand their fiscal policy, spend lots and tax little, because they've got to borrow. So remember, if government spending exceeds taxation, there's a need to borrow. And of course, if you're in the euro, you have to issue bonds in euros. So any fiscal debt has to be funded by euro bonds, and that has effect on all countries. So they introduced what they called a Stability and Growth Pact, which limited the amount of fiscal deficits that the countries could have. Now, this is an argument against the single currency, but I would also say that even in the UK, we have our own version of the Stability and Growth Pact, in that the governments have over time, it's been suspended at the moment, but over time, we have wanted to limit the amount of fiscal debt that the country has anyway. So these 2 points here, loss of monetary and loss of fiscal, and the inability, therefore, for individual countries to have control over their economic policies, is a big argument against going into a single currency. And I think, I would make a big point of this, because if you are a weaker economy, then when you join the currency, you will lose control over the ability, for example, if you're going into, say, a recession, to have a boost, an expansionary monetary and an expansionary fiscal policy. So I think it's important that you know that. And that is the reason why, before countries are allowed to join the single currency, they have to meet the convergence criteria. In other words, there ought to be a sort of the same level of economic cycle going on, the same level of efficiency within these economies, etc. Take, for example, if one economy was quite weak and had low productivity, poor education and training, etc., etc., then over time they are going to weaken against the stronger countries. Therefore, they're going to have slower growth. If they have slower growth, they're going to have higher unemployment, and there almost has to be this sort of fiscal transfer within the European Union from the stronger currencies to the weaker currencies, as I say, because of the inability of those countries to put in policies to stimulate their own economies when they need to. So, both of those points I would bring as a big drawback. And you could mention then that the EU is not, possibly, some argue it is, because of the convergence criteria, but it's not really what they call an optimal currency area. Now, that's not part of your Edexcel syllabus, but it's useful to know. An optimal currency area needs flexible labour markets and a free movement of that labour. Well, maybe in the single currency you've got that. Flexible prices and wages, mobility of capital. Again, you could argue with the single market there is that. A centralised budget, well, there is that as well, and similar business cycles. And I think it's that is sometimes the problem, where if one country is downturning in their cycle, they want to have lower interest rates. Another one is still, doing quite well in terms of economic growth. They don't want lower interest rates, they might want higher interest rates, and there's this sort of problem of, does one size fit all in terms of the interest rates that are set within the currency. So, again, a good, hopefully, a useful way of looking, move that one out of the way for you, looking at the idea of the benefits and the drawbacks of countries joining a single currency. So just to recap, I would bring those points in. There would be an increase in trade and hence economic growth and therefore job creation, etc. There's an increase in investment, inward investment, improved inflation, more stability, enables companies within your country to invest, but the big drawbacks are the loss of your economic policies, definitely monetary policy, and to a certain extent the fiscal policy. So that's your analysis of a single currency. Now all we need to do is have a look at countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and maybe some of these West African states to see whether they are going to benefit or have benefited from joining a single currency. So hopefully that helps.